Yes, I want to go through a little journey, if you don't mind. And obviously, I think most of the people in this audience know that culture matters. But I want to take a slightly closer look at some of the examples. And the first thing that just strikes me, since the first study I did of the impact of art and culture on the economy was in 1985 or 4, and I'm actually astonished that we're still saying, well, what's the evidence? What's the evidence? And that somehow we've got a sort of collective loss of memory of the 500 or so studies, some of them are excellent, perhaps some not good, but nevertheless, there is a body of work there that tells us a lot. But the most important thing for me in the end is when one's judging the value of these projects, it's also about having a judgment through other criteria that are not only the economic. So I just wanted to mention that. Now, I mean, we can obviously start culture broadly, and one of the interesting sayings, you probably know it all, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Many business economists say that, and they mean that in the very broadest sense about organisational culture, but going down into the narrower sphere of the arts itself. And indeed, of course, it is the in a sense, the other invisible hand that guides the way we operate, work, the level of confidence we might have in a region or something like that. And so, as we all know, it's part of our DNA, and how that operates can be either an obstacle or something positive. And obviously this event today, tonight, is a positive example of all of that. But unfortunately, when you look at the institutions, in a sense, it's not the sort of default position. I've looked at lots of pieces of evidence. For example, I did some work about high-speed rail. And if you look at the pieces of evidence to say, yes, we should have high-speed rail and stopping here and there, the levels of evidence are far lower than is required for culture. And so I just want to hope that that point is remembered. Anyway, for me at least, it's a crucial point. And one of the issues about it is culture in broad senses and narrow senses adds value. But it does something more interesting, to me at least. It can add value economically, but values simultaneously. You can create projects that do so many things simultaneously, not only the narrow facts and figures. And that's a very powerful tool. If you think of something else that could do that, I would be very surprised. So therefore, we do know that there is a culture dividend, and some of these figures were already mentioned today. You know, I mean, there's lots of work on what is the value of good design and increasing property values, etc., etc. There's lots of work on what happens when you have heritage buildings in cities, what they do to the city, and so on. So that cultural dividend I don't really want to talk about. But what I do want to say is a simple question, and for me this is a liberation. I, for many years, have always tried to calculate what's the value of, and I never do that anymore, which is basically, instead of asking what is the value of art, culture, creativity, design, heritage, and so on, I always ask what is the cost of not thinking about these things. And name me a place that is successful, that is very weak on culture, art, heritage, design, and all of those things. And once one asks that question, you immediately see that there's something quite rich in this sphere. So some people say, of course, culture doesn't matter because it's soft, because it's intangible, because some of the evidence might be anecdotal and so on. And I think, let's just take some examples and just remind ourselves. So if we look at the visitor economy as an example, of course the first places that did something about this were you know, going to Chartres, going to various Santiago de Compostela and things like that, and indeed going to places like Barcelona. And Gaudi, as you know, was an intensely religious person. And why did Barcelona, just of memory, re-emerge 30 years ago? The idea of going to Barcelona was seen as utterly unusual, but now of course it's on everybody's map. So this is the finished inside of the Sagrada Familia. So I'm just going from larger cities down to smaller cities and then ultimately rural examples. So that's just one example and just one reminder that has shaped the identity of that city that has re-emerged with a certain level of distinctiveness, which is Barcelona. here is Berlin, and I just came back from Berlin last week, and I was asked to help out, not help out, but be part of a lobby group. Because a lot of what has made Berlin, Berlin, and everybody talks about, you know, Berlin, the creative place, it's really it, and all of those sort of things which you know about. And it's partly to do with sort of people who are slightly unusual. You know, who, in this case, squatted buildings, set up art halls where you just have shows where lots of types of people can present their work and so on. And there's a major debate in the city at this moment about a hotel tax, which would raise 40 million. And the Chamber of Commerce is absolutely behind the fact that these odd people here, which you see some of them there, should get a large proportion of that resource, because they at the moment get perhaps 3% of the total cultural budget in the city, but they are very largely the source of the interest there. And the danger in a place like Berlin, just as an example, of course it's gentrifying so wildly because in fact it's incredibly successful, and so we have all those dilemmas. Here's another example. This is Zurich. I'm just using the big cities going to the small ones. This is a brewery. Many breweries have been converted. It's a museum, it's an art centre, it's lots of other things. It's got commercial galleries inside. But what is that building next door? It's the Zurich Business School has moved in. Why does it want to be there? You know, I'm not going to tell you why. But it's precisely the association and the inspiration, in part, that artists and the artistic community give to places as a whole. And what you then see as you just wander around, of course, there are all these companies, you can see the names, they're all well-known names, IT, high-tech companies and so on. And indeed, if you look around and you wander a bit further down a couple of those streets, you see this, which you also saw in London and other places, which is Louis Vuitton, Yayoi Kusama, an artist, which, whether you like it or not, and this is the dilemma between culture and commerce, who's helping Louis Vuitton project itself globally in the world as the must-be place. And I realise there are real dilemmas in all of these movements and dynamics that are going on. And indeed you can see this in a place which is again very nearby. There's a hotel called Renaissance, and I thought this rather interesting artist, just in exactly the same script, wrote Resistance, which shows you that gentrification dilemma that we know happens but can be sorted out. Now, one of the interesting things about old buildings, and Jane Jacobs, who's one of these big urbanists, city people who sort of saved Greenwich Village in New York, she said, new ideas need old buildings. And this old building, many will know, you will know, is the old Nokia factory in Helsinki. Now, today, more people work in that factory than did then. And what are they? There are combinations of people working in museums, small creative economy companies, a whole combination of commercial and non-commercial entities which have a sort of ecosystem there. But there's 800 people in that building who are surviving within the arts economy. And the same can be seen in other places. This happens to be Rotterdam. We're getting to slightly smaller cities where these sorts of environments you know and have seen, where young innovators like to work. But if you go to a smaller town, and I'm going now to the green city of Europe, which is Freiburg, here is a whole development which is called the Sonnenschiff, which means the sunship, solar-powered whole environment. And these 80 buildings, which all interlock, are co-designed by artists and architects. And that's given it a sort of signature, which has made it, in some sense, compelling for those types of entities that are here, which is very mixed. There are offices on the top there, you can see people have their dwellings, houses in fact, and various forms of retail, all related in one sense to the green economy and so on. And if you just take here an old school, I'm only showing you this old school because the next picture you will immediately recognise from a drawing by Escher, because this is Escher's school, and this is the staircase, the famous staircase, in his school, which he drew and which we all know. But in that building is precisely a version of many of you people here, which is the Creative Economy Agency for Arnhem in the Netherlands. But most interestingly, what I thought, this is just the station, the local station, and you can see there, it says Fashion Quarter. And here's an inspiring initiative by the local authority, which has a lot of social housing. And in that social housing, there are obviously shops, and they've given the students coming out of the art school chances to have a shop of their own. And of course, because there's a critical mass of these small shops, all socially owned, owned by the local authority, people have the opportunity to both have a studio but also a shop front to do things. But because there are many of these shops, of course it becomes an attractor and has become, a place where other things move in as well. Now, we of course know there is a danger in, putting old places into aspect, and this is why your event here is so fantastic, because something lively is about to happen any moment. And I was in Tilburg recently, and I was in a textile museum, and I thought, I've seen textile museums. I don't want to be negative about textile museums at all, but you know what they're like. And I discovered that the director wasn't a museum director. He was an anthropologist. And he did something which I thought was fantastic. He basically used the old machinery and got the companies who made that old machinery to give new machinery, and then invited young people, artists, or young producers, to create new fabrics and new things out of the old and the new machinery. So this place that is a museum is also about the future. It is a showroom of future products and so on. So the point I'm really making is this blending of the past and the present is actually a very interesting thing to do. But just looking at things in terms of more this sort of wacky perspective, I saw this place in Roubaix near Lille, which was, as you can see, a swimming pool, and the guy said, look, I want to go to the out's edge, to another another place. And the museums guy said, well, I actually want a museum. So out of the swimming pool, they created a museum, and it's been really quite interesting when you see inside this museum, which is actually in the swimming pool. And that what they of course do sometimes is they cover the water, and then you have events on the water. But all of these things, I don't need to explain in any way, obviously sort of somehow widen the imagination and one's perspectives and give one a different view of things. Another example I was involved in is in Mantua. I remember being there many, many years ago, and there were lots of young book dealers whose parents had already set up the bookshops, but they, as the young people, liked each other. And they were declining, there was lots of printing there. So I, in fact, sort of said, look, go to Hay on Wye. They went to Hay on Wye, and these bookshops, which all looked like that, had one major asset, which was that they collaborated. They collaborated together. They weren't competitive, even though they were all bookshops. Now, 12 years later, their festival is the largest literary festival and become an ideas festival, probably in Italy. I think it is in Italy. But it's also triggered again and re-triggered the printing-based, social media-based economy in this place, which is near Verona. And obviously they use the old settings as anyone would in an historic Italian place. Another example that I think is interesting, because I know you've got something about fire here, is Providence, Rhode Island, where they covered up the river and concreted it over and put a motorway in. They therefore decided to uncover it, and through their thing is about light, I think it's called the Forces of Light, they just, every so often, about 20 times in the summer and a bit less frequently in the winter, they march symbolically to the reopened river with all these torches and stuff like that, and on these boats there are all this music coming together, and there's about 10 to 20,000 people gather practically every weekend just to sort of be there and share experiences together. And it's so simple, it's just a bit of sound and a few, torches. So that's again an interesting example, a simple idea that has had a great impact. One of the most interesting examples for me, and perhaps the best in Europe of its type, is the Ruhr area in Germany, near Dortmund, Essen and so on, where basically their main the main strategy was in a sense to reinvent the past through the eyes of the future, and therefore not erase memory, and in this case it's an industrial memory. And when you go there, I've wandered around these things, probably wouldn't allow us to do it here in Britain, I'm not sure, but anyway, But wandering around those things at night is obviously quite a deep experience and gives you both that sense of memory and not erasing memory, as well as some sense of future. And obviously within that, there are the concert venues and things of that nature. And one thing that always strikes me, a place which I think is quite similar to some of your cities around here, Derby, etc., is Ghent in Belgium, which, and this is one of the issues, that sometimes things can become too popular. They have tried to reinvent themselves for the future economy, very much based on a knowledge-intensive economy. But they decided to have a festival of light. The problem about it is it's become too successful. They've had to, after 3 stagings of it, actually block the city off. Now I'm just hoping that whatever DIDA does and what you all do creates such a buzz that you have the problem of blocking the city off rather than having to persuade people that it's a good idea. But you just wander around the city, and as you wander, you just see all of these things completely transformed in an interesting artistic way. So there you are. This is just some people emerging from some building, and you don't know who they are, but they're just looking at you in a strange way. And here's a blurry picture just to prove that there are a lot of people there, and indeed possibly too many. There's another example which I've always loved, because I've worked quite a lot in Albania, believe it or not. And the mayor of Albania said, the mayor of Tirana said, I know I can't solve the internal problems of people in the buildings and all of that, but what I do know is that colour has a psychological effect. And if we just simply paint some buildings, perhaps that will generate motivation and energy to do other things from which other things will flow. And here's just one of the buildings I like, which is showing the direction to the airport. It's pretty clear which direction it is to the airport. But you see what I'm saying? These are simple devices, and I'm not saying you paint your buildings like that and have arrows on the building. But it's just reminding us that simple things can have a large impact. Indeed, Hundertwasser, who's quite a well-known artist, painted this sewage works in Osaka. This sewage work is a destination for sewage, but also one of the biggest tourist destinations in Osaka. So, you know, even out of a sewage works, you can create a destination with a few simple ideas. And even if you go to rural areas or places a bit further away, Umeå, which is European Capital of Culture in a couple of years' time, on the outskirts of that, what they've been doing is really dressing trees and having strange ways of leading from the outskirts of the city into the forest through these strange pathways, which is effectively, I suppose you could call this, dressing trees. So just to keep in the north, because it's a bit cold, Oulu. Oulu is where the mobile phone was invented. Northern Finland. A Nokia research centre was there. This is where it comes from, and Gorbachev made the first phone call on a mobile apparatus. But they have 2 things that make them, relatively speaking, famous in a niche way. And it reminds me, any place can be famous for something if you try hard enough. And it's this guy, Petri Syrjölä. And his choir, which travels to New York, Sydney, and these sort of big cities, is a shouting choir. You just shout as loud as you can. And in a strange way, this shouting, which seems completely mad and insane, which typically Finnish in the best sense of the word, is actually quite invigorating. So that's one thing. You see all these old and young guys who simply learn to shout, and I've spoken to quite a few of them, and they just say, it's part of my identity. If I haven't been a member of that choir, I'm not a real person from Oulu. The other thing they do, typically Finnish again, is they have the World Championships of air guitar. So, there's people doing this. I mean, you can probably do it much better than me. But the World Championship of air guitar, several thousand people come up to the north to watch, mostly guys and occasionally now women, do air guitar. You know, the last winner was a French guy. So here, we're looking at a place which is doing things which are completely unexpected. Now, one of the final examples I want to give you is about identity and love. And there was one of the biggest marriages ever took place, mass weddings. And this mass wedding took place in Durham, America, not the UK. And there was a lot of bad mouthing about Durham. Durham's a university town, but obviously some people think it's boring and dull. And so someone has launched a project which says, what's the best commitment you have to your place? Of course, it's to marry someone or to marry it. So 1,600 couples married, individuals, married Durham in their largest church. And that, I think in itself, I know it's a bizarre event, but somehow indicates the sort of quirkiness that you can sometimes use to make interesting things happen. So going from marriage to death, this guy here, Felicouri, who did the bid for the European City of Culture in Bologna and all that, very successful, there was a political shenanigans and stuff like that, and he was punished and told to go to the cemetery department. So get him into the cemeteries, that will keep him bloody quiet. So he set up the Association of Significant Cemeteries, won a Cosa Nostra Award, European Award, and has used digital technology to bring the dead alive. Because a cemetery, of course, is about stories. Of course, that's what better than a cemetery as a storytelling place. So one of the biggest computers in Europe is in Bologna, coincidentally, and together they've collaborated, and their autumn season has just finished, and they had 50 events of doing things which are obviously partly stories, but partly really awakening the cemetery itself. So all I'm really saying is there are lots of things one can do. And so the central question of all of this is really, I mean, for me, I feel so jaded because of these arguments have been made for such a long time about art and why it's important. But I suppose we just have to remind ourselves again and again that it is significant. Of course we want the best of it. We don't want dull art. We don't want, there's obviously the quality thing. And of course I realise, and we all realise, that it's often invisible. The values are intangible and so on. But I think really, not everything is countable by money. But, of course, art and culture is a currency that provides often the oil to make a place work in some sort of enriched way. And indeed, it is the thing that is rather like a magnet, because each place is really always looking for centrality for itself, for a purpose in some sort of way. And in that context, I do believe artistic and more broadly seen cultural projects are really a draw that drag people together in all sorts of interesting ways. But more importantly, they do something bigger. They generate that sense of curiosity. And curiosity is the precondition to make economies, societies, cities, places work. And once you set up an environment which allows things like elemental forces to happen, like here, you're beginning to create the conditions where people can think, plan, and act with imagination. And once that takes place, you suddenly find lots of hidden resources emerge which may have other benefits, which may not be the exact artistic project itself. And so therefore what one's doing is creating imaginative solutions to problems and opportunities. So that's why I'm saying there is a plan B. And that plan B really does require moral courage on the part of some of the institutions that are more economically based and so on, to really believe that this is not just anything. Because we all know about the dramatic transformations that have occurred. We know the shift to China. We know that the world is a smaller place, and that creates all sorts of issues, some positive, some negative, that therefore more cultures are mixing and so on. That's the world we live in. And to some extent, it is requiring us to see the world in a different way. But one of the dangers of it is that it makes our culture bland because it's just a global culture. And it's this element of distinctiveness and specialness that I find so fantastic about events like elemental forces. So these issues are happening everywhere around the world. Everybody's asking this question again. How can I rethink what my place, my town, my rural area, my city looks like. And it requires people to move away from this hardware thinking and more to this software thinking. We love engineers, but what's more important is generating an emotional experience. And creating emotional experiences requires some of this deep-seated culture thing, because that allows us to meet, combine together, exchange ideas, play together, which is really what places are about, because that's where, the future lies. Thank you very much.